So I was asked on my Discord community how I would rate the various Aloy teams based on DPS, and I thought, you know what, it sounds like a really good video idea, so I wanted to really talk about it. Now, that being said, I'm not going to go calculating DPS because, I actually want to have time to edit my own videos, and instead I'll be going primarily off vibes and how I feel about them. So basically, just using various targets to sort of get a rough idea of how they perform. Now, that being said, Aloy does have quite a number of teams that she can play, especially these days, being that she is a cryo character, so that's of course pretty good, but she's a cryo on-fielder, which kind of limits her teams a little bit. I am rather confident in how I rank these teams, but ultimately, if you have better artifacts for one team over another, you're probably going to have a better experience using that team as opposed to a team that I think is a lot better. So let's go through the 7 teams that I feel like she can play in, starting with the worst, and I do want to use that in heavy quotations because even though it's the worst, it's still quite functional, I think. And then we'll go over to the best, which I am very, very confident is actually the best Aloy team that exists. We'll start with Fridgeloy. This is a team named for being a Fridge team with Aloy. At first, I'm not really that excited about Fridge, just in and of itself. It does not seem to be super duper powerful. And then on top of that, Fridgeloy, especially with Nahida, doesn't seem terribly impressive either. Mainly because if you're using Nahida, well, unfortunately Nahida's ultimate is completely wasted. So I don't even think that's necessary, unless you're running Medic Nahida. Otherwise you could use someone like DMC, but that involves using DMC, and I personally don't like using DMC. But you can still use Fridgeloy with DMC, and you can probably do fine. But ultimately with Bloom teams, you have to basically build everyone except Aloy to do a lot of Bloom damage. Otherwise you're probably going to end up screwing yourself over with weaker Blooms, and that just becomes a complete meme in and of itself. So the reality is that your Fridgeloy team's probably not going to do that much damage in the long run. There is, however, an alternative, which is Hyper Fridgeloy, being a Hyper Bloom Fridge team with Aloy. Incidentally, the person who asked me to rank these Aloy teams was also the person who actually showed me the full power of Hyper Fridgeloy, and I'm actually quite impressed with Hyper Fridgeloy. Whilst Nahida's EM share via her ultimate is ultimately wasted, you can still use Nahida's ultimate to actually use her off-field Dendro application even faster, thanks to the fact that you at least have one Electro character. Obviously, if you have C1, then you're already good to go, but if you don't have C1 Nahida, then having that Electro character is actually really, really useful. You only need to build your Electro character as well to do the Hyper Bloom damage, so with the new flower set, you only need to put that specifically on someone like Fully MA, Yae Miko, Lantern Lisa, Dory, Kuki. You have options, right? So that's pretty good. The only weakness I can think of with regards to the Hyper Fridgeloy team is that you can't really bring along someone like Kaz or Sucrose, so that means you can't really force Ice Rush. You're going to have to bait enemies into your bomblets, basically working as intended. Ultimately, I think I would put Fridgeloy number 7 and Hyper Fridgeloy at number 4 of the 7 teams that I'm going to be talking about. But they're still decent, I think. Especially Hyper Fridgeloy. Hyper Fridgeloy actually seems pretty impressive to me. Alright, let's talk about some reverse melt teams, starting with Mageloy, aka Nucloy, named for being a team dedicated to using Aloy's ultimate ability to do a ton of burst damage. But that's really all that Mageloy is about. It's just basically doing a whole lot of damage per screenshot. And whilst damage per screenshot is really, really nice, it's not really damage per second, let's be real here. You do end up having quite a bit of time where you're just sort of setting up, and you're not really doing a whole lot of damage in the meantime. So that's why I feel like Mageloy is not going to be as strong as some of the other teams that I'm going to be talking about, and one of those alternative teams is going to be Meltloy, named for being a team that focuses on causing melt reactions with Aloy and your off-field pyro application character, aka Xiangling, or even Thoma. Usually though, it's Aloy who's causing the reverse melts, which actually does mean that Aloy can do some pretty decent damage. Essentially the idea is you want to have something like Pyronado just go sort of running around in a circle, and then in the process you're just doing a whole lot of normal attacks with Aloy via Ice Rush, and at that point you can also bring along someone like Kaz, or you could just do some other shenanigans in order to make sure that you are doing as much damage as you can. Your damage for screenshots will be a little bit lower, I think, than Mageloy, depending on how you build your Mageloy, but you will still be able to do quite a lot of damage with your normal attacks, which I think should be enough to make up for that difference. Also, your off-field pyro application or your off-field pyro damage character will also be doing quite a lot of damage as well. Xiangling generally is very, very strong for that regard. The main weakness of Melloy is that generally speaking you're still relying on an expensive ultimate though, so for example Pyronado or even Thomas Crimson or Yori being a somewhat energy hungry ultimate, it's going to be something you have to deal with in the long run. That was until 3.2 came out, because with 3.2 came Nahida, and with Nahida came a team called Burnloy, named for being a team that uses the burning reaction to provide constant pyro application for reverse melt on Aloy's normal attacks, and also her ult, thanks to Nahida. So Nahida's Dendro application is actually really good to continue triggering burning. You can basically use that to maintain the pyro aura, and with that maintained pyro aura you can do reverse melt using Aloy's normal attacks. And on top of that, because you're playing with someone like Nahida, you can then use Nahida's ultimate to provide an EM share bonus, which actually becomes useful as opposed to Fridgeloy and Hyper Fridgeloy, whereby your Aloy's normal attacks can do a lot more reverse melt damage, to the point where it actually becomes similar reverse melt normal attack damage to one of the teams that I think is a lot stronger. But either way, it's very, very impressive, and in fact quite strong in a short-term case, at least. But that being said, you do have to contend with ICD though, because you're doing reactions in order to do that kind of damage, so it's going to be something you have to keep an eye on. That's really the only weakness of Burnloy, is the fact that you have to deal with an ICD, and there is a little bit of annoyance with Burnloy in that sometimes Nahida's Dendro application kind of becomes a little bit way too dank, and at that point you end up losing the pure cryo application and the pure cryo aura that you can then try and swirl off with someone like Kaz. It does kind of become a bit of a meme trying to figure that out, but with specific rotations I think you can actually bypass that, so that should be really, really good. Or you could just try and get rid of the underlying pyro aura somehow, which you can, because you can potentially just sort of redo and sort of do the quote-unquote wrong thing with Aloy's ICDs. But in terms of rankings, I would put Mageloy at number 6, Meltloy at number 5, and I would put Burnloy at number 3. I feel like Burnloy is stronger than Hyper Fridgeloy, but you could potentially make the argument that Hyper Fridgeloy is in fact stronger than Burnloy. I'm not 100% sure about that myself. But the main thing about Burnloy that I think would make it stronger than Hyper Fridgeloy is that you're able to bring along someone like Kaz or Sucrose in order to help fix up the Ice Rush situation. So number 1, you're able to get that cryo application out even faster. And then number 2, you're also able to swirl cryo, which basically means you're doing even more damage with Aloy. And that's really, really good as well. Alright, let's move on to what I think is Aloy's second best team, being Aloy National, named for being basically a national team that has Aloy. I think I've heard some people call it multiversal, but I'm not 100% sure about that myself. Basically, you're trying to trigger as many vapes and melts as possible, whether it be vapes, reverse vapes from Xiangling, or potentially reverse melts from Aloy, or potentially even forward vapes from Yelan. For some reason, I actually am noticing a lot of forward vapes from Yelan on this team, so this might actually end up being like a Yelan supported team somehow. Just kind of hilarious. Either way though, you can use the pyro application from someone like Xiangling not just to actually trigger a lot of forward vapes, but also to trigger a lot of reverse melts from Aloy, and that also includes reverse melts via her ultimate, which basically means there is a bit of a nuking potential as well. Once again, it's not necessarily going to be as strong of a nuke compared to Mageloy, but you're still able to do quite a decent amount of damage with this team. I think though at this point Aloy is not really providing a massive portion of damage to this particular team, but the cryo application is helping somehow. I'm just not 100% sure how it's working myself, but at least in my observations, it's doing something. With regards to the rankings, I will probably put Aloy National as number 2. At this point though, the difference between number 2 and number 1 is going to be minimal at best. Speaking of her number 1 team, what do I think is Aloy's strongest team? Well, it's basically going to be the team that really hyper-focuses on Aloy's normal attack damage as well, and that is of course going to be Freezeloy, named for being a freeze team with Aloy. So the thing about Freezeloy is that you are doing a lot of damage with Aloy's normal attacks. We're basically doing the kinds of normal attack damage that you would see from Burnloy when you do a reverse melt on a specific ICD attack. But because it's not ICD based, because we're working with freeze, we're not working with burn, or rather we're not working with reverse melts, ICD is therefore not relevant, which basically means you can do the same kind of damage with as Burnloy without ICDs, which means all your normal attacks are doing really, really high damage. So on top of that, as long as you have a Hydro character that can A, provide the necessary Hydro to keep enemies frozen, or B, provide a lot of off-field Hydro damage, then you're basically doing a lot of damage. And that's why I think that Freeze Loy is even stronger than Burn Loy. It also makes it easier for you to build characters in Burn Loy because you only need to focus on getting as much crit damage and attack as you can, with the possible bit of crit rate as well, just so that you can maintain a higher crit rate when you have the 4-piece Blizzard Stray out passive active. Also, if you're using something like Thundering Pulse, then your ultimate doesn't really matter in the long run. You can still do some decent damage, around 60-70k, at least in my experience, but you're mainly just sacrificing your ultimate, sacrificing in quotation marks, your ultimate, so that you can do even more normal attack damage thanks to the passive of Thundering Pulse. With regards to the rankings, I still think that Freeze Loy is Aloy's strongest team, but ultimately there is a bit of a caveat where Freeze Loy obviously has way more damage coming from Aloy, whilst Multiversal has way more damage coming from your off-fielders. Freeze Loy, of course, doesn't really care about ICD at all, whereas Multiversal kind of sort of does, and also Freeze Loy would only be particularly effective against enemies that can be frozen. So for example, in the 3.1 Spiral Abyss, when they were trying to sell Nilou, Freeze Loy was very, very effective there, but ever since 3.2 we've started to see a lot more bosses in Spiral Abyss, so at that point Multiversal is really becoming more useful compared to Freeze Loy, and hopefully Sunday we will see another Spiral Abyss where we can use Freeze Loy and just really pop off, but otherwise Multiversal is still really, really strong. That's how I feel about the various Aloy teams that exist. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. How do you feel about the Aloy teams? How would you rank them as well? Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, hope you guys enjoy this. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact action, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye!
Wisdom! This'll pack a punch. Everybody stand back! Let's... This is a new one. Ha!